Patricia Montgomery stood before the imposing entrance of St. Mary's General Hospital, her Louboutin heels clicking against the concrete as she shifted her weight uncomfortably. The pristine glass doors reflected her immaculate appearance. Perfectly styled ash-blonde hair, designer suit, and a face that had seen the best dermatologists money could buy. Yet beneath this polished exterior, her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her Hermes bag. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she muttered, checking her watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital's facade, reminding her that she was already 10 minutes late for her first day of mandatory volunteer work. The words from last week's court hearing still rang in her ears. "Ms. Montgomery, in light of your reckless behavior and complete disregard for public safety, this court sentences you to 500 hours of community service at St. Mary's General Hospital's geriatric ward." The judge's words had felt like a physical blow. Patricia, daughter of real estate mogul William Montgomery, had expected her father's army of lawyers to get her out of this mess, just like they had done countless times before. But this time was different. Her father had refused to intervene. "You're 47 years old, Patricia," he had said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "It's time you learned that actions have consequences. Maybe this will finally teach you something about responsibility." Taking a deep breath, Patricia pushed through the revolving doors into the hospital's lobby. The stark contrast between this sterile environment and her usual haunts, exclusive country clubs and 5-star restaurants, made her stomach turn. The antiseptic smell, the squeaking of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the distant beeping of medical equipment, it all felt alien and beneath her. At the volunteer services desk, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and practical clothes looked up from her computer. Her name tag read Martha Stevens, volunteer coordinator. "You must be Patricia Montgomery," Martha said, her tone neutral but her eyes scrutinizing. "You're late. Traffic was terrible," Patricia lied smoothly, though they both knew the real reason was her reluctance to be there. Martha stood up, grabbing a folded bundle of pale blue fabric from a shelf behind her. "Here's your volunteer uniform. The bathroom is down the hall if you'd like to change." She paused, taking in Patricia's expensive outfit. "I suggest you wear more practical shoes tomorrow. You'll be on your feet most of the day." Patricia stared at the shapeless scrubs in horror. "You expect me to wear this? Unless you'd prefer to spend your time in jail instead." Martha's reply was sharp, and Patricia felt her cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment. In the bathroom, Patricia changed into the volunteer uniform, carefully hanging up her designer suit. The scratchy fabric felt foreign against her skin, and the woman in the mirror looked like a stranger. Gone was the sophisticated socialite. In her place stood someone who looked ordinary, unremarkable. "Just get through this," she whispered to her reflection. 6 months, and then everything goes back to normal. But when she emerged from the bathroom, Martha was waiting with news that would shatter that simple plan. "You'll be working primarily with one patient," she explained as they walked toward the elevator. "Her name is Rose Sullivan, 90 years old. She's been with us for 3 months now." "What exactly am I supposed to do?" Patricia asked, trying to keep the disdain from her voice. "Talk to her. Listen to her stories, help her with meals and basic needs. Rose doesn't have any family left, and she's been increasingly withdrawn lately. We're hoping some one-on-one attention might help." The elevator doors opened to the geriatric ward, and Patricia's heart sank further. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with rooms containing elderly patients in various states of decline. Some were sleeping, others staring vacantly into space, and a few were talking to themselves or calling out to passing nurses. Martha led her to room 412, where an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair by the window. Despite her age, Rose Sullivan carried herself with a dignity that made Patricia pause. Her silver hair was neatly arranged, and though her hospital gown was standard issue, she had somehow managed to make it look elegant. "Rose," Martha called softly. "This is Patricia. She'll be spending time with you over the next few months." Rose turned her head slowly, and Patricia found herself caught in the sharpest pair of blue eyes she had ever seen. They seemed to look right through her carefully constructed facade, past the designer clothes she no longer wore, beyond the privileged life she had always known. "So," Rose said, her voice surprisingly strong and clear, "you're the rich girl who's been sentenced to spend time with us common folk." Patricia felt her face grow hot. "How did you—" "News travels fast in a hospital, dear," Rose interrupted, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Even in the geriatric ward, especially in the geriatric ward." She gestured to a chair beside her. "Well, since we're stuck with each other, you might as well sit down. Tell me, what terrible crime did you commit to end up here?" Martha cleared her throat. "I'll leave you two to get acquainted. Patricia, remember what we discussed about patient dignity and respect." As Martha's footsteps faded down the hallway, Patricia reluctantly took the offered seat. She had expected a doddering old woman, someone she could easily ignore while serving her time. Instead, she found herself face to face with someone who seemed to see right through her carefully constructed walls. "Well," Rose prompted, raising an eyebrow, "I'm waiting. What brought the daughter of William Montgomery to my humble room?" Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "It was just a misunderstanding. I was at a charity gala, had a few drinks, and I might have borrowed one of the vintage cars on display and taken it for a short drive around the block." Patricia's voice grew defensive. "The owner was being dramatic. There was barely a scratch on it." "Borrowed without permission," Rose corrected. "That's called stealing, dear. And from what I heard, you crashed that 1957 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL into a fountain." Patricia's cheeks burned. "How do you know all this?" "I may be old, but I'm not dead. I read the newspapers, watched the news. Your little joyride made quite a splash, if you'll pardon the pun." Rose's eyes twinkled with amusement. "So here you are, sentenced to spend time with an old woman who's seen far too many entitled young people waste their lives thinking the world owes them something." "I'm not—" Patricia began, but Rose held up a frail hand. "Save your protests, dear. I've lived through a war, lost a husband, raised 3 children on my own, and buried them all. I've seen the best and worst of humanity, and I know entitled when I see it." She paused, studying Patricia's face. "But I also know that people can change, if they're willing to learn." Something in Rose's tone made Patricia fall silent. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not as William Montgomery's daughter, not as the socialite who graced charity galas and magazine covers, but as someone who might be lacking in ways she had never considered. "Now," Rose said, settling back in her wheelchair, "since you're going to be here for quite a while, why don't I tell you a story? One that might help you understand a few things about life, love, and what really matters in the end." Patricia wanted to refuse, to maintain the wall of indifference she had built around herself. But those piercing blue eyes held her in place, and she found herself nodding, despite her reservations. As Rose began to speak, neither woman realized that this was the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the quiet hum of medical equipment and the distant sounds of hospital life, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Rose Sullivan's hands rested quietly in her lap, weathered and thin like dried parchment, but her eyes sparkled with vitality as she began her tale. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, glancing at her watch, a habit she'd soon learned to break. "Put that away," Rose commanded, her voice carrying an authority that made Patricia comply instinctively. "Time moves differently here, dear. You'll learn that soon enough." The elderly woman turned her gaze to the window, where autumn leaves danced past in the morning breeze. "Let me tell you about 1945, she began. "I was just 14 when the war ended, but I already knew more about loss than any child should." Patricia opened her mouth to protest. She hadn't signed up for a history lesson, but something in Rose's expression made her hold her tongue. "My father owned a small grocery store in Brooklyn," Rose continued. Nothing fancy, mind you, not like your father's real estate empire. But it was ours, and we were proud of it. Then the war came, and everything changed. My brother James enlisted right away. Handsome boy, always eager to prove himself. He never came back from Normandy. The matter-of-fact way Rose spoke of her brother's death made Patricia uncomfortable. In her world, unpleasant things were glossed over, pushed aside, handled by lawyers and PR teams. After James died, my father changed. The store began to fail. He'd forget to order stock, wouldn't open on time, sometimes wouldn't open at all. We were drowning in debt, and I watched my mother cry herself to sleep every night. Rose's fingers traced invisible patterns on her blanket. Then one morning, a man came to our store. His name was Howard Sullivan. "Your husband?" Patricia asked, surprising herself with her interest. Rose nodded, a soft smile playing at her lips. He'd just returned from the Pacific Theater. Still wore his uniform sometimes. It was the only nice clothing he owned. Howard had nothing to his name except determination and a heart bigger than Brooklyn itself. She laughed softly. "Do you know what he did? He started coming to the store every morning before dawn, helping my father with the inventory, organizing the shelves, chatting with customers. He didn't ask for a penny." Patricia frowned. "Why would he do that? What was in it for him?" "That's exactly what I asked him one day," Rose replied, her eyes twinkling. "You know what he said? Some things aren't about profit, Rosie. Sometimes you help because it's the right thing to do." She fixed Patricia with a pointed look. "Imagine that, a man with nothing, giving his time to help strangers, while today, people with everything can't spare a moment for anyone but themselves." The criticism stung. But before Patricia could defend herself, Rose continued. "Howard saved our store. But more than that, he saved my father, showed him there was still good in the world. Still reasons to wake up each morning and try again. 6 months later, Howard asked my father for permission to court me. I was 15 by then. He was 22. "That's horrible," Patricia exclaimed. "He was far too old for you." Rose chuckled. "Different times, dear. We married when I turned 18, and I never regretted a day of it. Howard taught me what real wealth looks like, and it has nothing to do with money." A nurse appeared in the doorway with a meal tray, interrupting the story. "Lunchtime, Mrs. Sullivan. Patricia, would you help her with her meal?" Patricia stared at the tray of hospital food with barely concealed disgust. She had never fed another person in her life, and the thought of it made her stomach turn. But Rose was watching her with those knowing eyes, and somehow refusing felt impossible. With trembling hands, Patricia helped Rose with the soup, surprised by how difficult it was to perform this simple task. Her expensive manicure clicked against the cheap plastic spoon as she struggled to find the right angle, the right speed, the right amount. "You're trying too hard," Rose observed between sips. "Relax. Let me tell you what happened next, while Howard was building his construction company from scratch." As Rose continued her story, Patricia found herself falling into a rhythm with the soup. She learned that Howard had started with a single truck and a handful of workers, many of them fellow veterans struggling to find their place in the post-war world. "He never turned away a man who needed work," Rose said proudly, "even when we could barely afford to feed ourselves. Howard would hire another veteran, share what little we had. People called him a fool, said he'd never succeed in business that way. They were right," Patricia said. "That's not how you run a successful company. My father always says—" "Your father," Rose interrupted gently, "would be interested to know that Sullivan Construction became one of the largest building firms in New York by 1960. Not because Howard was ruthless or clever with contracts, but because every man who worked for him would have walked through fire for him. Loyalty, Patricia, real loyalty, can't be bought. It has to be earned." Patricia set down the empty soup bowl, her mind spinning. Everything Rose said contradicted the business principles she'd grown up with. Her father's voice echoed in her head. "Business is war, Patricia. The only rule is win at all costs." "But that's not why I'm telling you this story," Rose continued, her voice growing softer. "Howard died last year, did you know that? Patricia shook her head. 96 years old, still visited his workers' families, still remembered every birthday, every anniversary. At his funeral, thousands came, children and grandchildren of men he'd helped, families he'd supported through hard times. Each one had a story about Howard's kindness, his generosity, his integrity. Rose's eyes filled with tears, the first crack in her composed facade. The night before he died, he took my hand and said, "Rosie, I didn't make billions, didn't build an empire, but I helped people stand tall again after the war took their pride. I gave them work when they needed it most. And most importantly, I loved you with everything I had." Then he smiled and said, "That's a life worth living, isn't it?" Patricia felt something wet on her cheek and realized with shock that she was crying. She couldn't remember the last time she'd cried, really cried, not the theatrical tears she sometimes employed to get her way. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. Rose reached out and took Patricia's perfectly manicured hand in her weathered one. "Because, dear, you're living in a war too, not one with bombs and bullets, but a war against meaning, against connection, against your own humanity. And just like my father after losing James, you're losing yourself to it." The words hit Patricia like a physical blow. She wanted to pull her hand away, to run from this room and never return. But Rose's grip, though gentle, held her in place with surprising strength. "I watch the news, remember?" Rose continued. "I've seen your pictures in the society pages. The parties, the scandals, the endless pursuit of more. But look at you now, wearing scrubs, feeding an old woman soup, listening to stories about people who had nothing but gave everything. Tell me, what does that make you feel?" "Uncomfortable," Patricia admitted. "Out of place, like I'm not myself." "Or perhaps," Rose suggested. Rose, her blue eyes piercing, "exactly like yourself, without all the armor you've built up over the years." Before Patricia could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway. "Patricia, it's time for Rose's physical therapy session. You can head home for the day. We'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp." Patricia stood on shaky legs, gathering her belongings. As she turned to leave, Rose called out, "Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the summer of 1950, when Howard and I lost everything we owned. It's a story about what really matters and what doesn't." Walking through the hospital corridors toward the locker room, Patricia felt strangely unsettled. She had expected this volunteer work to be tedious, humiliating, a punishment to be endured. Instead, she found herself thinking about Howard Sullivan, a man who built his success on kindness rather than cutthroat tactics. About Rose, who spoke of losing everything with the same grace she showed in discussing her triumphs. In the locker room, Patricia changed back into her designer clothes, but somehow they didn't feel quite right anymore. As she drove her luxury car home through the gathering dusk, Rose's words echoed in her mind. A war against meaning, against connection, against your own humanity. For the first time in years, Patricia Montgomery wondered if perhaps she wasn't winning her war, but losing it, one designer purchase, one empty party, one meaningless day at a time. The next morning, Patricia arrived at St. Mary's 10 minutes early, surprising both herself and Martha at the volunteer desk. She had barely slept, Rose's stories and words tumbling through her mind all night. As she changed into her scrubs, she noticed they didn't feel quite as scratchy as they had yesterday. When she entered room 412, she found Rose already awake, sitting in her wheelchair by the window. But something was different. The elderly woman's shoulders were tense, and her usually bright eyes seemed distant, focused on something Patricia couldn't see. "Good morning," Patricia said, trying to sound cheerful. "You promised me a story about 1950? Rose didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gestured to a small wooden box on her bedside table. "Bring that here, and please." Patricia retrieved the box, noting its worn edges and faded finish. Rose's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs and what appeared to be a charred piece of paper. "Do you know what this is?" Rose held up the damaged document. This is all that survived from our first house. Our insurance policy. Ironic, isn't it? Everything else burned to ash one hot summer night in 1950. Patricia sat down, her full attention captured by the pain in Rose's voice. The older woman smoothed the burnt paper with careful fingers. Howard had just secured his biggest contract yet, building a new school in Queens. We had finally saved enough for a down payment on a little house in Brooklyn. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. We had a garden out back where I grew tomatoes. Our first child, James, named after my brother, was just learning to walk. Rose's voice caught slightly. That night I'd fallen asleep reading to little James. The fire started in the neighbor's house. Faulty wiring, they said later. By the time we woke up, smoke was already filling our bedroom. Howard ran through flames to reach James's room, got our boy out safely, but suffered terrible burns in the process. Patricia found herself reaching for Rose's hand without thinking. Was he okay? Eventually, but the burns meant he couldn't work for months. The hospital bills piled up. We lost the house, the savings, everything. The contract fell through because Howard couldn't oversee the project. In one night, we went from finally getting ahead to being completely destitute. Rose pulled out a photograph from the box. A handsome man with burn scars visible on his arms and neck, smiling broadly while holding a toddler. This was taken about 6 months after the fire. Know what Howard said when I found him crying over our losses one night? He said, "Rosie, we lost the house, but I got our boy out. I'd burn 1,000 houses to keep him safe." Patricia thought about her own father, about the times she'd seen him sacrifice relationships, principles, even family ties for business success. Would he run through fire for her? She wasn't sure anymore. But that's not even the real story, Rose continued, her voice taking on a different tone. The real story is what happened next. The men who worked for Howard, those same veterans he'd hired when no one else would, they came together. Every single one of them volunteered their weekends to help rebuild our lives. They brought food, clothes, toys for James. Their wives took turns watching him while I picked up work as a seamstress. She pulled out another photograph, a group of men in work clothes, standing in front of a partially constructed building. They wouldn't let Howard's company fail. They worked extra hours, took pay cuts, found ways to keep the projects going until he recovered. One of them, Tommy Martinez, even mortgaged his own house to help cover some of the costs. They risked everything, Patricia said softly. For your husband? No, dear. They did it because years before, Howard had risked everything for them. When they were at their lowest, he gave them work, dignity, purpose. That's the thing about true generosity. It always comes back to you, usually when you need it most. Patricia thought about her own circle of friends, if they could even be called that. Would any of them mortgage their house to help her? Would they even answer her calls if she lost everything tomorrow? Rose wasn't finished. But the real miracle wasn't the help we received, it was what we learned. After the fire, every piece of furniture in our new home was second-hand. Our clothes came from charity. We ate simple meals and counted every penny. And you know what? Those were some of the happiest years of our lives. Happy? Patricia couldn't hide her skepticism. Living in poverty? We were never poor, Rose corrected firmly. Poor is when you have nothing to give. We had love, loyalty, community. Every Sunday we hosted dinner for Howard's workers and their families. I'd cook enough spaghetti to feed an army, and everyone brought something to share. Those meals, sitting on mismatched chairs around borrowed tables, were worth more than any fancy restaurant dinner. Patricia thought about the charity galas she attended, where people paid thousands per plate to be seen with the right people, to maintain their social standing. When was the last time she'd had a meal that actually meant something? The fire taught us what wealth really means, Rose continued. It's not about what you have, it's about who would stand beside you when you have nothing. Howard never forgot that lesson. Even years later, when the company was successful again, he kept those Sunday dinners going, said they were more important than any business meeting. Rose's hands trembled as she carefully returned the photographs to the box. Last week, Tommy Martinez's grandson came to visit me. He's a successful architect now. Told me he got his start because Howard paid for his college education. I hadn't known that. Howard never mentioned it. Just like he never mentioned all the other lives he quietly touched over the years. Suddenly, Rose's demeanor changed. She gripped Patricia's hand with surprising strength. Now tell me something, Patricia Montgomery. What would people say about you at your funeral? Would they talk about the expensive cars you crashed, the parties you attended, the money you spent? Or would they tell stories about lives you touched, people you helped when they needed it most? The question hit Patricia like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. In that moment, a nurse entered with Rose's medication. "Time for your pills, Mrs. Sullivan," the nurse said cheerfully. "And then we need to get you ready for your afternoon tests." "Tests?" Patricia asked, concerned by the sudden shift in conversation. "Just routine," Rose said dismissively, but Patricia caught something in her eyes, a flicker of fear, quickly hidden. "I'll be back tomorrow," Patricia promised, standing to leave. But as she reached the door, Rose called out to her, "Patricia, remember? It's never too late to start building the legacy you want to leave behind." Walking to her car that evening, Patricia passed a young mother struggling with grocery bags while trying to calm a crying child. Without thinking, she stopped to help, carrying the bags to the woman's car. The simple "thank you" she received sparked something unfamiliar in her chest, a warmth that all her expensive purchases had never managed to create. At home, instead of heading straight for her usual glass of wine, Patricia found herself opening her laptop. She began researching Howard Sullivan Construction Company, reading old newspaper articles about their projects, their impact on post-war New York. She found photographs of company picnics, charity events, scholarship programs, but it was a small obituary notice from the previous year that finally broke her. Among the hundreds of comments were messages from families spanning generations, each telling a story of how Howard Sullivan had quietly changed their lives. A loan here, a job there, a word of encouragement, a chance when no one else would give one. Patricia closed her laptop and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights. For the first time, she saw past the glittering surface to the lives being lived in all those buildings, lives like Rose's, full of loss and love and meaning, lives so different from her own empty existence of endless parties and superficial relationships. Her phone buzzed with a text from one of her socialite friends, inviting her to an exclusive club opening. For the first time in her life, Patricia Montgomery typed 2 letters that would mark the beginning of her transformation. No! The following week brought changes that neither Patricia nor Rose had anticipated. Patricia arrived for her morning shift to find Rose's room empty, the bed stripped bare. Her heart stopped until Martha appeared behind her, touching her arm gently. "She's in ICU," Martha explained softly. "There were complications during her test yesterday. Her heart isn't as strong as we'd hoped." Patricia felt the world tilt slightly. "But she'll be okay, right? She's strong. She's 90 years old, Patricia," Martha reminded her gently. "And she's been declining for a while now. She just didn't want anyone to know." The ICU was a different world from the geriatric ward. More machines, more urgency, less of the quiet dignity that Rose had maintained in her regular room. Patricia found her behind a glass partition, looking smaller and more fragile than ever among the beeping monitors and IV lines. "The doctor will be doing rounds soon," Martha said. "You might want to wait and hear what he has to say." Patricia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She pulled up a chair next to Rose's bed, careful not to disturb any of the tubes or wires. Rose's eyes fluttered open at her approach. "Well," Rose said, her voice weaker, but still carrying that familiar hint of amusement, "I suppose this isn't quite how I planned to tell you about my health issues." "Why didn't you say something?" Patricia demanded, surprising herself with the intensity of her emotion. "All those stories about the past, and you never mentioned—" "That I'm dying," Rose finished for her. "Dear girl, I'm 90 years old. Death isn't a tragedy at my age. It's the natural conclusion to a life well lived. Besides, I had more important things to teach you than lessons about mortality. Before Patricia could respond, a doctor entered, young, efficient-looking, with kind eyes behind his glasses. He introduced himself as Dr. Chen and began explaining Rose's condition in medical terms that made Patricia's head spin. She caught phrases like congestive heart failure and limited treatment options before Rose interrupted. "In simple terms, Doctor," Rose said firmly, "Patricia isn't family, but she needs to understand." Dr. Chen nodded. "Simply put, your heart is failing, Mrs. Sullivan. We can make you comfortable, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We're talking about days, maybe weeks, not months." Patricia felt as though someone had punched her in the chest. "There must be something. Procedures, specialists. My father knows people, the best doctors in the world. I could—" "Patricia," Rose's voice was gentle but firm, "stop. This isn't something you can fix with money or connections. Some journeys have to end, and I'm at peace with mine." After the doctor left, a heavy silence fell over the room. Patricia stared at her hands, noticing absently that her perfectly manicured nails were chipped. She'd been too busy lately to maintain her usual grooming routine. "You still owe me a story," she said finally, trying to keep her voice steady. Rose smiled. "Ah, yes. I promised to tell you about Howard's biggest failure, the one that taught us our most valuable lesson." She shifted slightly in the bed, wincing. "But first, I need you to do something for me." "Anything," Patricia said immediately. "In my room, in that wooden box you saw, there's a letter. I need you to deliver it for me." "Today?" Patricia frowned. "To whom?" "William Montgomery, your father." Patricia felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. "My father? You know my father?" Rose's eyes took on a distant look. "Oh yes, I know Billy Montgomery. Known him since he was a young man with dreams bigger than his conscience." "The letter? Well, he'll understand when he reads it." Patricia's mind was reeling. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you needed to learn these lessons without that connection clouding things. Now, will you deliver the letter?" Patricia nodded mutely. "Good. Then I'll tell you about 1965, when Howard's mistake cost 3 men their lives, and how he learned that success without integrity is the greatest failure of all." Rose's story began as Patricia hadn't expected, not with tragedy, but with triumph. Howard's company had been thriving, winning bigger contracts, expanding rapidly. They were finally wealthy by any standard, living in a beautiful house, sending their children to private schools. Howard was riding high, Rose recalled, maybe too high. He took on a project, a high-rise apartment building, that was bigger than anything we'd done before. The timeline was tight, the budget even tighter. The developer was pushing for speed over everything else. She paused, her breathing becoming slightly labored. Patricia automatically reached for the water cup, helping her take a sip. "Thank you, dear. Where was I? Ah, yes. Howard's foreman, Mike Reeves, came to him with concerns about the steel they were using. Said it wasn't up to code, that they needed to replace it. But replacing the steel would have meant delays, cost overruns, possibly losing the contract entirely." Patricia could see where this was going, her stomach tightening with dread. Howard convinced himself it would be fine, just that once he chose profit over principle. 3 weeks later, a section of the 9th floor collapsed during construction. 3 men died, including Mike Reeves. Rose's voice cracked slightly. "I'd never seen Howard so broken. He turned himself in to the authorities immediately, admitted everything. The company almost went bankrupt from the lawsuits and fines. But do you know what he did next?" Patricia shook her head. "He sold our house, our cars, everything of value we owned, used the money to set up trust funds for the families of the men who died. Then he rebuilt the company from scratch, this time with a new motto: no profit is worth a life. He never took another shortcut, never compromised on safety, no matter the cost." Rose reached for Patricia's hand. "Your father was the developer on that project, Patricia. He tried to convince Howard to cover up what had happened, to protect them both. When Howard refused, Billy swore he'd destroy him. Instead, he watched as Howard's honesty and integrity eventually brought more success than any shortcut ever could. Patricia felt as though her world was shifting on its axis. She'd grown up hearing her father's business philosophy. That sentiment was weakness, that the end justified the means. Now she was hearing a very different version of the man she'd idolized. "The letter," Rose said softly, "contains the full story and proof of what really happened. I've kept it all these years because Howard asked me to. Someone needs to know the truth," he said. "Someone needs to remember that choices have consequences." A nurse entered to check Rose's vitals, frowning slightly at the monitors. "Mrs. Sullivan needs to rest now," she said firmly. "Go," Rose told Patricia. "Deliver the letter, but remember, the truth doesn't have to destroy. Sometimes it can set people free to become better versions of themselves." Patricia gathered her things, her mind spinning with revelations. At the door, she turned back. "Rose, I'll be back tomorrow. We have more stories to share." Rose smiled, but there was a sadness in it that made Patricia's heart clench. "Of course, dear, tomorrow." As Patricia drove toward her father's office, the letter seemed to burn in her bag. She thought about all the lessons Rose had shared, about wealth, about integrity, about what really matters in the end. She thought about her own life, the empty parties, the meaningless relationships, the constant pursuit of more. The security guard at Montgomery Enterprises recognized her immediately, but something made her pause before taking the express elevator to the executive floor. Instead, she found herself walking toward her father's private elevator, the one she'd been specifically told never to use. It was time for some truths to come to light. William Montgomery's private office occupied the entire top floor of his building, a testament to power and success with its floor-to-ceiling windows and modern art worth millions. Patricia had been here countless times, but today it felt different. The sleek furniture and expensive decorations that had once impressed her now seemed hollow, like props in a play about wealth rather than actual signs of it. Her father looked up from his desk, his silver hair perfectly styled, his custom suit immaculate as always. "Patricia, this is unexpected. Is everything all right with your community service?" He said the last words with barely concealed disdain. Patricia placed Rose's letter on his desk. "I have a delivery from Rose Sullivan." The change in her father's expression was subtle but unmistakable, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible tension in his shoulders. "Rose Sullivan," he repeated carefully. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in many years." "She's dying," Patricia said bluntly, watching her father's reaction. "In the ICU at St. Mary's, the same hospital where you sent me to learn my lesson." She paused. "Was that really why you chose St. Mary's, Dad? Or did you know she was there?" William Montgomery stood, turning to face the wall of windows behind his desk. "What's in the letter, Patricia?" "The truth about the Harrison Heights project in 1965, about the 3 men who died, about how you tried to cover it up." Her father's shoulders stiffened. That was a long time ago. Business was different then. Sacrifices had to be made. Sacrifices? Patricia's voice rose. 3 men died. And Dad, they had families, children, and you tried to bury the truth to protect your profits. "I built an empire." William turned back, his face flushed. "Everything we have, everything you've enjoyed your entire life, came from decisions like that. The world isn't black and white, Patricia. Sometimes hard choices have to be made." "Like Howard Sullivan's choice?" Patricia challenged. "He chose the truth, chose to make it right with those families, even though it cost him everything. And look where it got him, dead and forgotten while you what, Dad? Built bigger buildings, bigger. Made more money?" Patricia gestured at the office around them. "Is this what winning looks like? Because I've spent the last few weeks listening to stories about a man who had nothing but gave everything, who built his success on integrity instead of lies. And you know what? His funeral had thousands of people whose lives he touched. Will yours?" The words hung in the air between them. William Montgomery slowly sank back into his chair, suddenly looking older than Patricia had ever seen him. "Read the letter, Dad." she said more gently. Rose kept it all these years because Howard believed someone needed to remember that choices have consequences. But I think maybe he also kept it because he believed in redemption. With slightly trembling hands, William opened the letter. Patricia watched as he read, seeing emotions play across his face that she'd never witnessed before. Grief, shame, regret. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "I was so young," he whispered, "so hungry for success. I told myself the ends justified the means, that sentiment was weakness." He touched the letter gently. "Howard tried to tell me there was a better way. I wouldn't listen." Patricia's phone buzzed. A text from Martha at the hospital. Her heart stopped when she read it. "Rose's condition is deteriorating rapidly. If you want to say goodbye, come now." "Dad," she said urgently, "Rose is dying, right now. Come with me." William Montgomery stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. Together, they rode down in his private elevator, father and daughter, both changed by the truth they'd finally confronted. At the hospital, they found Rose drifting in and out of consciousness, her breathing labored. Patricia took one of her hands while her father, after a moment's hesitation, took the other. "Billy Montgomery," Rose whispered, her eyes focusing briefly. "You finally came to visit." "Rose, William's voice caught. "I'm sorry for everything." A slight smile touched Rose's lips. "Howard forgave you, years ago. Said carrying anger was harder than carrying grace. I didn't deserve his forgiveness. That's the thing about grace, Billy. It's not about deserving." Rose's eyes drifted to Patricia. "Your daughter. She reminds me of you. The you I knew before ambition ate your soul. But she's learning earlier than you did. What matters? What lasts?" Patricia felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "Rose, please, you have more to teach me." "No, dear. You have all you need now. The rest is up to you." Rose's breathing became more labored. "Billy, the Harrison Heights families, it's not too late." William Montgomery straightened, understanding in his eyes. "I'll make it right, Rose. I promise." "Good," Rose whispered. "Howard would be pleased." Her eyes closed briefly, then opened again with effort. "Patricia, remember what I told you about wealth? That it's not about what you have," Patricia said through her tears, "but who would stand beside you when you have nothing." "Yes," Rose's voice was barely audible now. "You're not poor anymore, dear. You're very rich." Her hand went slack in Patricia's grip. The monitors began their final alarm, but Patricia barely heard them through her grief. She felt her father's arm around her shoulders, offering comfort for the first time in years. 3 months later, Patricia stood before the newly dedicated Rose and Howard Sullivan Community Center. The building, funded by Montgomery Enterprises, would provide job training, childcare, and support services to struggling families. Behind her sat the families of the Harrison Heights victims, each now benefiting from trust funds that dwarfed the original ones Howard had established. Her father stood at her side, changed by Rose's final gift of truth and grace. The ruthless developer was learning, slowly but surely, that true legacy is measured in lives touched, not dollars earned. As Patricia cut the ribbon, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the building's windows. She no longer saw the entitled socialite who had crashed a vintage car in a drunken bid for attention. Instead, she saw someone else. Someone who understood that real wealth couldn't be measured in designer labels or social media followers. The community center's first program would be a series of Sunday dinners, where families could gather, share meals, and build the kind of connections that had meant so much to Rose and Howard. Patricia had insisted on this detail, remembering Rose's stories about mismatched chairs and borrowed tables, about the richness found in simple moments of shared humanity. Later that evening, Patricia visited Rose's grave, placing fresh flowers beside the simple headstone. She sat on the cool grass, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "I understand now," she said softly, "what you were trying to teach me. About wealth, about purpose, about leaving the right kind of legacy." She touched the grass gently. "I'm not finished learning, but I'm trying. Every day, I'm trying." As she stood to leave, Patricia noticed a young woman struggling with several bags while trying to calm a crying child. Without hesitation, she walked over to help, remembering that this journey had started with one simple act of kindness. "Let me help you with those," she said, smiling. "You know, I once knew a woman who taught me that the richest people aren't those who have the most, but those who give the most." And as she shared Rose's story with this stranger, Patricia felt that familiar warmth in her chest, the kind that no designer purchase had ever provided. She was finally wealthy in all the ways that mattered, carrying forward a legacy of grace, generosity, and wisdom that would touch lives for generations to come. In the distance, the sun set on another day at St. Mary's Hospital, where lives continued to be changed in ways both large and small, and where an entitled socialite had once learned that the greatest transformation often comes disguised as punishment, and the richest gifts often arrive in the humblest packages. Has a story ever touched your heart so deeply that it changed the way you see life? What moment in this journey moved you the most? Was it the power of forgiveness, or perhaps the realization that true wealth isn't measured in dollars? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Look to your left. See that video? Trust me, it holds another journey that will touch your soul just as deeply. A tale of transformation that will leave you thinking about what truly matters in life. Don't miss it. Every story we share is carefully chosen to remind us of our shared humanity and the power of second chances. By subscribing, you're not just following a channel. You're joining a community of people who believe in the transformative power of storytelling. Hit that subscribe button and bell icon to ensure you never miss a moment of inspiration. Your support keeps these stories alive, allowing us to continue bringing you powerful narratives that remind us all of the extraordinary depth of human connection. Remember, sometimes the most meaningful changes in our lives come from the stories we hear and the wisdom we choose to carry forward. Thank you for being part of this journey. We'll see you tomorrow with another story that will touch your heart.